Okay, I think we'll get started as people come in. They can join along the way and try to catch up. Welcome and thank you for taking time to be with us today. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Jeff Kubiak. I'm a professor of practice at ASU, where I serve as the director of future security education in ASU's Future Security Initiative. The educational offerings I help guide include the MA in Global Security, the MAGS, which has a non-technical concentration in cybersecurity and a brand new concentration in irregular warfare. We also offer a graduate certificate in global security and competitive statecraft, and we're building a new portfolio of short courses on similar topics to be offered in ASU's Career and Professional Development educational outlet called Career Catalyst. Today's event is one in a series of events we run each fall and spring semesters to highlight the thought-leading security practitioner faculty that teach in our programs. Tonight's guest is Professor Candace Rondeaux. Candace is the Senior Director for Future Frontlines and directs the Planetary Politics initiative at New America. More importantly, in this setting, she's a professor of practice with the Future Security Initiative at ASU and teaches courses in proxy warfare and a brand new course this fall in open source intelligence in our MA. Tonight's event is titled Securely Insecure, Examining the Demographic Divide Over National Security Threats and U.S. Foreign Policy. We'll also have a conversation, however, on a range of topics about which Candace and her teams at Planetary Politics and Future Frontlines are currently researching and publishing. So I'm going to make Candace go wide and far in her current work at New America. Candace and I will engage in a discussion, but feel free at any time to jump in with a question in the Q&A block in your Zoom window, and I'll try to weave your question into our conversation as I can. Your participation is important, welcome, and appreciated. So, Candace, we'll get started with the topic, with the title of the topic. You were the one who suggested it, so I'm going to make you explain that to me and to the rest of us why it is you came up with that topic and what it means to us.
Yeah, well, thank you, Jeff. It's good to be back here at the MAGS webinar again. Well, the origin of this work that we've been doing in cooperation with the Chicago Council on Global Affairs for the last 3 years almost now, really started actually during the pandemic, when COVID-19 had us all shut inside our house, and the response on the street to the George Floyd killing in the spring of 2020 just sort of left us open with a lot of questions about how America views the nature of security. And talking with some colleagues at New America, we started to ask the question, well, what do we really know about what Americans think? And it turns out that there's actually only a few organizations that have been consistently asking that question, which is, what is security to you, Mr. and Mrs. America, right? Chicago Council on Global Affairs is one. Another is at William and Mary University, which usually polls think tank analysts and specialists looking at their views on American foreign policy. But of course, most importantly, the most kind of consistent source of information about how America views its role in the world, how it views foreign policy, also threats from outside, as well as opportunities from outside, comes from the Director of National Intelligence. And so in our first year pondering this question, we looked at all of the survey data out there. We looked at several different years worth of DNI, Director of National Intelligence reports and threat assessments. And we saw that really over the last 20 years, there's been a pretty substantial shift in how people think about threats and opportunities from an American perspective. It won't surprise you, of course, that in 2020, people were still thinking about terrorism. Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, ISIS, these issues were still front of mind in 2020. But increasingly, the data showed that climate was becoming one of these issues, priority issues that kind of moved up the ranks in terms of where Americans were starting to feel like there was a threat that the nation needed to handle, that governments needed to pay attention to, but there weren't many good answers. So those two trends were very obvious in 2020. But that was just from kind of, a research, just basic literature review, if you will. We wanted to find out, especially because the COVID pandemic had been so divisive on a partisan level, between Democrats and Republicans, but also had broken down in some respects along racial lines, because of so many people of color being affected on the front line, especially during that first year of the pandemic. So we wanted to ask really the question, so, well, what is the difference between the way different types of Americans think about these types of questions? And we partnered with the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and we did something called oversampling, which is a fancy way of saying we asked more African Americans and more Native Americans and more Asian Americans and Latin Americans than there actually are proportionately in the country, their views on national security and foreign policy challenges. And we did that because we know that there's a long history of kind of division over big questions like the use of military force between different communities. And while it's partisan, meaning between the two parties, Democrat and Republican, further below that, there are other sort of little shades of gray and white and black that kind of all sort of indicate that different communities have different views. And so in the first year, we focused our attention on three big buckets. We looked at climate change and asked a lot of questions about climate change and how people feel about it. We looked at immigration, and then we looked at use of force. And these are the typical kind of buckets that the Chicago Council tends to look at. And what we found, interestingly, is that the majority of Americans, this is 2022, felt that climate change was a number one threat from the outside that the United States really needed to confront. And there were similar concerns about Russia and its role in Ukraine, of course, because things were very much front of mind then. But terrorism, interestingly, had slipped way to the bottom, almost to the point where it wasn't nearly as relevant. Immigration and challenges over the border, of course, were front and center for a lot of folks. So that first year, what it told us is that the vast majority of people of color, African Americans, Latin Americans, and Native Americans, that's a sampling that we did the first time, feel more threatened by climate change than their white counterparts. And this could be for a variety of reasons. Again, we didn't do that year, we didn't do focus groups. But one assumption is that many people of color typically live on the front lines of environmentally exposed areas of the country. They may not have as many resources available to them to deal with climate impacts, or they may have experienced, a history of progressive disasters because of where they live, due to past redlining and segregation and all kinds of things like that. So that was a really interesting finding, and it told us that there's more digging to do. We then decided that this year in our work, we wanted to kind of get a little bit more nuance because it's an election year. And while there's a kind of an old saw that, Americans don't vote on foreign policy, that it just doesn't influence how Americans think, I think we've seen this year, in actual fact, that's not the case. We've seen voters go to the polls in Michigan most recently during the Democratic primaries and vote uncommitted. About 100,000 individuals showed up at the polls in Michigan in February and said, we want to vote, but we're not sure who to vote for. Trying to send a message to the Biden administration about its policies on Palestine and Israel and the conflict there. And so, and I think there are plenty of other examples, and I would sort of count the question on immigration being actually a very central one, and how we think about our borders becoming such an issue. And this year in particular, we've seen a logjam in Congress over the question of border safety and security versus security and support to democratic allies in Ukraine, Taiwan, and Israel. And even as I speak, just down the block from me, Congress is locked in a huge debate. And maybe we might lose another speaker of the House over this question. So to say that, foreign policy doesn't matter to domestic politics is a little bit off the mark. And certainly the focus groups that we just held with the Chicago Council with 4 different communities. So again, we went and looked at African American opinion, Latin American opinion, Asian American opinion, but then we decided to pivot a little bit and look at youth. Because one thing that we also noted is that the way, Gen Y, Gen Z responds to questions about human security, national security, America's role in the world is really, really different than their older peers. And I would just sort of count the Israel-Palestine divide as probably one of the most, poignant examples where the divide between the baby boomer generation, right, Joe Biden's generation, and Gen Y is so wide that it is tearing, campuses apart. So that's in a nutshell kind of what we wanted to look at. We can dig into a little bit more about some of our findings that I thought were quite surprising. But definitely, I would say in this year, one thing that's really important to understand is that 12% that divides these sort of undecideds between Donald Trump, the presumptive Republican nominee, and Joe Biden, the presumptive Democratic nominee, is really going to be influenced by some of these questions that we're talking about.
That's interesting. That's important. When I read some of that material in advance of this, I was struck by the old adage, a phrase coined by former Foreign Relations Committee Chair Arthur Vandenberg during the 1948 discussions about post-World War II treaties. And I thought, it's been a long time, honestly. It's been a long time since I can remember when politics ended at the water's edge, right? I mean, politics certainly, in this country have extended well beyond our sense of that. And I'm wondering if we can ever first of all, is that something that has always been the case and we just papered over it, in 1948 and beyond for a little while, in that early Cold War era, maybe into the middle of the Cold War? Or is this really something new? And can we expect this situation, do you think, to continue to grow and be exacerbated by any number of issues across the American polity?
That's a great question. I certainly think that history shows that, the question of U.S. external engagement with the world has always been there since really the formation of
Right.
the country, right?
Absolutely.
Right. It was Madison who warned, not to engage in foreign dalliances and adventures, right, and misadventures.
It seems like
And
all the founding fathers said that at one point in time, actually.
that's right.
Yeah.
And one reason, why it sort of becomes easy to do that is just geography.
Right. It's a
We
water's
have,
edge comment, right? I mean,
that's right,
yeah.
exactly. There have been plenty of thinkers who've written about this challenge, which is we can't get out of our heads, which are primarily continental and land-based. And yet we know that our trade relationships, not only with our neighbors in Mexico and Canada, and of course, further to the south in Latin America,
Mhm.
have been crucial, right, to our economic growth, our evolution as a country, the cultural exchanges. I mean, just within our own hemisphere, the Western Hemisphere alone, which of course well extends beyond the edge of water, right?
Right.
We've had these exchanges.
Right.
I think that, when you're talking about sort of classic national security questions and sort of where the government should and should not tarry, we've always been on a pendulum swing between isolationism and engagement. And I think that actually is reflected in the data that we see from Chicago Council and also in the focus groups. I was talking with some of our colleagues in Chicago about the findings. We were going over them last week, and I commented that I thought it was really interesting how every single group, and this is a group of about 30, 40 people from all over the country, had inflation as their number one sort of anchoring
Sure.
issue, right? And one of our colleagues from Chicago said, well, actually, that's not that new. We're always concerned about what we're spending abroad versus what we're spending at home, and that
Right.
priority tension. I would say, I mean, he's a bit more sanguine than I am, but I was struck by the fact that this tension over gas prices seems to be linked in many Americans' minds with the war in Ukraine
Hmm.
primarily. And in fact, every single time there was sort of a conversation about this, it would be sort of, gas prices and then Ukraine.
Okay.
Um, so,
Huh.
I think we should always expect that. The places where, or the times in our history where that's been less of a question, of course, is like these peak points of emergency. So right after, World War II, Pearl Harbor, right after Pearl Harbor, it was no question, we got to do what we got to do.
Hmm.
Right after 9/11, no question, we got to do what we got to do. But it's when these emergencies extend and start to expose some of the moral conundrums
Hmm.
that we face when we use military force in particular, or some of the blowback that we get when we use sanctions. Um, you know, that is when it starts to become problematic. And we're seeing that right now, certainly with Ukraine and Israel and
Yeah,
Palestine.
interesting. It is. In fact, somebody wrote a book about that. Kubiak wrote a book about war narratives in American national will and war. And that book actually contemplates this idea about the durability of the war narrative, the discussion about what we have to do and why we have to do it, and then how that narrative comes into contact with reality and kind of can fall apart over time because different people suffer at different levels, the costs of these policies going forward. And so therefore the narrative can kind of collapse, especially over time as the suffering goes on. I could go on that one, but because I know that book pretty well. Um, so this is another thing that struck me as I kind of thinking through the difference in appreciation for what security means to different groups of Americans and across this patchwork country of ours is that the human brain is generally pretty incapable of appreciating scope and scale, right? So it's just hard to understand much of the world beyond kind of what you engage with day in and day out and the anecdotes of your life. It's just hard to appreciate kind of how the world works outside of what you're witnessing firsthand. And I wonder if the explosion of social media and the access that the internet provides us to the global goings on, if you will, actually is hurting or helping our ability to do that. Ideal. I mean, I remember when the internet first came to be and social media was just budding. It was about kind of flattening the world, bringing us all closer together because we can all share the same experiences. And yet, it strikes me that it's really warped our understanding in a lot of ways of what's going on in the world and what's important. Because I know what I think is important, and I can't imagine why anyone would think something differently because I know what the entire world looks like now. I don't just know what, this part of the northern valley of the sun looks like. I can engage it all. So do you think that this information space we're in is actually contributing to some of the divisions, some of the difficulties we have with seeing the world through each other's eyes?
100%. I think, you know, uh, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, let's just see, Facebook 2012 is kind of when it starts to go,
Right, right.
explode.
Yeah.
Twitter starts to kind of explode around that time, a little bit earlier. These were places where manipulation of information at that time was actually less prevalent. Sure, there was stuff going on, but the intentional manipulation of information by big actors, governments, wealthy individuals with a lot of cash to throw around, corporations, that is a phenomenon that is sort of that is a maturation of the actual technology itself on some level, our maturation in relation to it. That's been a big, big shift. I think one of the contributing factors is also that governments in particular have really struggled to find a way to present themselves as honest brokers in this. There's been so much distrust and so much manipulation over the last decade or so,
Yeah.
because of sort of very specialized marketing techniques that you can use on the internet
Sure.
and on social media platforms, that many Americans, of course, are just distrustful, and not just Americans, but of course the world. You have huge numbers of users of Facebook and Twitter.
Right.
So being authoritative is tough now, right? Even newspapers, which were once the sort of
Right.
gatekeepers, are finding it difficult to draw an audience consistently, and not become sort of the target of assassination on some level. So it is tougher now
Yeah.
to thread the needle.
Yeah, where are the Murrows and Cronkites of the world that can tell us how the world really works? And then we all believe it. So let's talk a little bit more about some of the other initiatives that you've got going on at the Planetary Politics Initiative, which I think is it's really fascinating. Again, I went through the website today just to kind of get a sense for what was going on. And it was really, really fascinating. But I came across to see, talking about other initiatives, there's an article on the very top of your website talking about centering justice in just energy transition. What is that? Why is it important? And is it really possible in this age of return on investment as being the driving force of most things in the global economy? Is this something that we can really carry the day for us?
Yeah, great question. So first of all, let me just give a shout out to my colleague, Hila Rasul Ayub, who is the co-director of the Planetary Politics Initiative. We work together very closely, and she has been leading the charge on all of our work having to do with energy transition and climate over the last year and a half, 2 years almost, getting pretty close.
Mhm.
And Gila and our colleague Martha Mafletas, who is based in New York, climate action activist and writer and thinker, held a workshop in January to look at this question of the kind of the unequal distribution of the burden of
Right.
those affected by climate change. And we kind of know this intrinsically. I mean, look, you're in Arizona. I mean, you know probably just as well as anybody else that climate change is affecting the cost of water, the availability of water, the cost of electricity, right?
Mhm.
It's in your everyday in a way that for me, a little bit further north, just off of the coast of the Atlantic, slightly cooler breezes. For me, those issues are not as prevalent,
Yeah,
right?
an interesting anecdote there, just to bring it up because I think it's kind of fun. My mom's 83. She lives in Green Bay, Wisconsin. She had a wonderful winter, right? She's 80. She doesn't snow ski, she doesn't snowmobile, she doesn't, nothing about it. It's just they saw grass almost the entire winter long. They had 70s in March. Climate change is affecting people differently in different parts of the world and in different economic statuses, right? She's comfortable where she's at. It's all good, but anyway, that struck me. It just struck me as she's having a conversation about her winter, especially when compared to our summer, where we had record number of days over 110 last year. So it's a interesting component. So the just piece. So the just piece. Where does that come in, and how do we use that? How do we center on justice then?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So, I mean, so using that example, this kind of these extremes, even in our quadrant,
Right.
but if you zoom out, right, and you look at the world, you start to see that actually, huge parts of coastal Asia, huge parts of coastal Africa, some 70 million people on the coast of Africa will be exposed to catastrophic emergencies because of rising water levels, right? Due to
Hmm.
the warming of the ocean.
Right.
Uh, in those instances, you're talking about not, cities knocked out, but whole ecosystems, food systems, uh,
Yeah.
transportation systems that are already really fragile, that have already had challenges because of the historical burden imposed from colonialism, that led to underdevelopment in lots of parts of Africa in particular, and obviously some parts of Asia as well. And, but also additional challenges from prolonged warfare in many cases. We know about the bottom billion, right? And how the challenge of being in a conflict-ridden country over time can just continue the spiral downward. So that inequality is about this kind of baked in historical trajectory that many vulnerable parts of the world are now facing as they additionally look at these impacts from climate emergencies and catastrophe. And so last year, you might remember at COP 28, so this is the big debate in Dubai, and the year prior to that as well, over how countries that are in the most vulnerable parts of the world, right? So a lot of island nations, there are about 20 island nations, they're called the Vulnerable 20, that have banded together as a coalition to fight for better support during climate emergencies and response to climate emergencies, just as one example. How is it that these countries that can have enormous amounts of debt from the International Monetary Fund because of the historical conditions that we just discussed, how can they then, pay their way out of a situation where they have to reconstruct whole parts of their coast, whole parts of their urban areas? And so the question has been around the creation of what's called a loss and damage fund, where essentially vulnerable states that are really exposed can be compensated quickly for reconstruction needs in a post-climate change or post-climate emergency situation. The idea is, rich nations should pay, and this is the justice part, just to get to the center of the question.
Right.
We have wealthy nations in the global north, the United States being one of the largest emitters in the world, right? Europe being another big emitter. These wealthy nations have been basically responsible for the conditions that led to climate change. And nations in the global south, developing countries, are saying, we need a recompense for this imbalance, right? Because you're exposing us to this high climate risk. But B, there's a debate going on now, especially in Africa, where there's enormous amounts of oil and gas resources that have been untapped as yet, as to whether or not it's really just and fair for a country like the United States to say, it's time to stop using, your gas guzzling truck, or and to move on to, electrified vehicles.
Right.
It's time to cap all oil and gas exploration and production, so that we can get a handle on this. Meanwhile, United States is one of the largest oil producers in the world and largest exporters in the world, and it happens to be one of the richest countries in the world, right? So this is the imbalance, and the justice question is, how do you square the circle between the need for addressing emissions, right, capping them in a variety of different ways, slowing down oil and gas production, reducing the amount of emissions from cars and trucks and so forth, reducing consumption, versus also ensuring that countries that still need to develop are not hindered in their development by these restrictions.
Right. That's seems like an insolvable riddle to me. Quite frankly, I mean, we've got a history of that as societies, but generally within a country, not globally, right? And within a country, we have forced big corporations to pay for the undesirable externalities of their operations over the course of time, force them to clean up rivers and force them to do other things that that damaged life for society at large and generated profits for the corporations, we've actually used regulations and the things that a sovereign government can do globally. That's going to be a very challenging feat to accomplish, right? And some sort of balance with understanding, like you mentioned. Uh, let's change gears on people just as they're barely getting started. Let's change gears and change the rules of the game. Um, I can see that as a challenge. Do you see any momentum or energy in this path, in this way within the power structures globally to do something? I mean, clearly we can talk about American domestic politics being a real problem to do anything positive in that field. But are there other forces moving in that direction, either private or public?
Yeah, so the loss and damage fund, while not funded yet, is the sort of outcome of a pretty long push by a group of vulnerable states, mostly led by Mia Mottley, who is the Prime Minister of Grenada. You know, sorry, Prime Minister of Barbados. I don't know. Sometimes I get those mixed up. But she's been a huge advocate for the last 4 or 5 years of creating sort of different means of debt cancellation, uh, you know, interest reduction for existing loans, again, the loss and damage fund. So that movement is definitely starting to, I think, build momentum. Otherwise, I wouldn't be talking about any of this, frankly. But there are others that are a little bit more um, kind of traditional, right? So one big question is around the cap and trade initiatives. That is for imposing a carbon tax on big emitters. So particularly in the oil and gas industry, Europe has managed to develop its own cap and trade system that is starting to take off and actually starting to build its own market. But the United States still lags behind
Hmm.
because of course, this internal tension over pretty much the same questions that everybody's dealing with, which is,
Right.
when does our sort of need to profit and sort of generate revenue end versus our need to also survive begin, right? That's the big question.
Yeah. Yeah, that question's going to get answered, I think, sooner than most people think, right? As I understand that a lot of Californians are already suffering this problem with regards to home insurance, homeowners insurance, right? Because insurance companies are actually backing out of certain regions based upon the threat of wildfire and almost the certainty of loss, which is coming based largely in a lot of ways on climate change. So that's going to be that's a cost that will eventually inflict pain at a level that will probably drive, in some fashion, political movement, um, potentially in a productive way, potentially in a less productive way. It'd be my estimation. All right, I'm going to shift gears because you do so much, and you actually run such your bandwidth at New America is really tremendous, and you've generated expertise across a whole range of fields in the course of the years that I've known you for sure. But I'm sure I know well before that as well. Um, let's go to your work at Future Frontlines, which is really exciting still, even though you were at the cutting edge of a discussion about the Wagner Group well before they were they're in the press everywhere. You and your team were covering them and researching what they're up to and uncovering all their operations. It's been what, almost a year since the Prigozhin Wagner-led rebellion in Russia. More than 6 months since Prigozhin's untimely death. Where are the Wagner Group? What are they doing? And what's the relationship now with Putin and Moscow?
Yeah, well, I mean, good news is Prigozhin is still dead, and he has not risen from the grave, despite many predictions to the contrary when he died in August of 2023. What has happened is his empire has been redistributed. Although I think there's some argument as to whether or not it was actually really ever fully his empire in the first place, which is, I guess, the origin of the mutiny. In any case, there's a big disagreement between him and Sergei Shoigu, the defense minister
Mhm.
of Russia, over actually who owned what and who was owed what. So money, as usual, was kind of one of the root causes of the disagreement there. But there were other issues as well. Supposedly some of those issues have been solved by a couple of different steps that have been taken since the rebellion and since Prigozhin's death in August. One of the first things that we saw is that a couple of figures came forward, a guy by the name of Yunisbek Yevkurov, who is the deputy chief of the GRU, along with Andrei Avyarnov, another GRU deputy. These two started to appear in meetings with the president of Central African Republic, with proxies in Libya, and namely Khalifa Haftar, who is an important partner of Russia in Libya. We've seen them travel to Sudan. We've seen them travel to Niger. They've been globetrotting around the world, but mostly very focused in Africa, because after the mutiny, there was a decision to create what's called the Africa Corps, which is essentially kind of the same machine, same setup, highly specialized, airborne operatives mostly, who are good at train and equip missions, so they know how to teach an army how to fight a guerrilla element in a given scenario, because that's often what you're facing in Africa. And so the Africa Corps is now officially under the Russian Ministry of Defense, and those who volunteer are essentially directly commanded by the Ministry of Defense through these different layers. So you have the main operations directorate on the one side, and then the GRU, which is the military intelligence wing that mostly kind of deals with the actual work of deployment, right? And fulfilling the mission on the ground. So that's big news, and that's big change. In theory, what that means is mostly reservists are joining up for these details. There may be new volunteers, but essentially those who agreed to lay down their arms in June, when the mutiny was done, and then went to Belarus or remained in place in Russia and signed new contracts, have been absorbed into Africa Corps. There is something that people still refer to as the Wagner Group, which is the first volunteer group, basically. It's still nonetheless part of the National Guard now, right, technically. And so everything has been brought under the government umbrella, although it always was. It was the fiction of the shell companies that Prigozhin created that was becoming problematic. And it became even more problematic, of course, once he was exposed, and he was no longer really a proxy. He literally was somebody who was fighting in this kind of conventional arena, and that's when his usefulness became not so useful.
Interesting. That's interesting. Interesting transition. So, what is the agenda of the remnants of the Wagner Group in Africa, the Africa Corps? What is what are the policy outcomes they seek there, besides being something of a disruptive force for a lot of folks?
So, I mean, the agenda is the same, and maybe the execution now is a little bit more orderly, and potentially a little bit less challenging and threatening to Putin in particular. But the agenda always was to create almost like an anti-NATO bloc in Africa. Russia doesn't have a lot of friends in Europe, as you can see. And, the number of friends it has in other parts of the world is relatively limited, especially compared to, let's say, the United States or even China. Its reach and its kind of alliance building has been, somewhat decayed by the post-Soviet period, right? And even in the Soviet period, it was difficult. And so, creating these kind of coalition relations with African nations that have difficulty with internal security problems and regional security problems, gives Russia that ballast it needs. And the ballast can be used in a couple of different ways. And this is the second point. The ballast is important in the setting of the United Nations, right? In the United Nations, Russia, for a good almost 2 decades after the collapse of the Soviet Union, didn't really have the same kind of clout that it did in the Security Council, despite the fact that it's a permanent member of the Security Council. There were a lot of limitations on what Russia could and couldn't do. There was a need to, a desire, as well as a need to cooperate with the West. And so, votes, for instance, I'll give you a very good example, on Iraq. While there was a division there in 2003, ultimately, Russia didn't also get in the way, right? Because it couldn't, because it could not the vote in the General Assembly. But now, Ukraine, Israel, Palestine, these are 2 fantastic contemporary examples where the building of this sort of anti-NATO bloc in Africa has allowed Russia to check the United States and its European partners in UN Security Council votes. That is really, has a high sort of rate of return for Putin, because it allows him to tell a story to the world that he is fighting for a different kind of moral good, right? A different vision of the world. And the last thing, the third point that's important, is Russia still needs to sell stuff. And right, just like any other country.
Looking for customers, huh?
Yeah, Russia still needs to do business. And its 3 biggest businesses are oil, gas, and guns. And that's been historically the case. It hasn't changed. You're not seeing, microchip computers flowing out of Moscow, or sort of, newfangled widgets flowing out of Moscow. That's not what's happening. What's happening is, big planes, big tanks, big guns. This is the #1 high value export that Russia has, other than the oil and gas industry. And so Africa and other countries represent an important market, a stable market that it can turn to and has turned to in the face of Western sanctions.
That's really interesting. Those are some really interesting, really interesting points. I had not thought about the fact that generating something of a just building some political capital, I guess, within the African countries, translated into some sort of power in the General Assembly, which translates into some sort of power, or at least a little bit more power within the Security Council. And that's a very interesting dynamic that I had not contemplated. I did see a headline today, and I didn't read the article, I should have, about the growth of the Russian economy over the course of the next year or so, actually outstripping all the developed countries. I didn't see where it was growing, but my assumption is, based upon your conversation, that it's in its kind of core commodities and advanced weaponry to its new partners, if you will. I wouldn't call them clients necessarily, like I would have back in the 1970s and 80s, partners in Africa as part of that operation. That's interesting. So it's really their support of governments who are going to be kind of at least friendly to Moscow. That is the agenda of the new African core for Russia.
That's right. And I would just say on the point on sort of Russian, economic growth, I think, the lower oil prices, the cap that has been imposed in some strange way has had this kind of perverse effect, because essentially now India and China, which, really in no way, shape, or form can be checked by the United States alone, right? Feel quite at liberty to buy as much cheap oil from Russia as they like. They know that the United States is not going to do anything because it values the kind of equilibrium and the relationship much more than sort of the punitive gift that it might get from sanctioning India, say, for instance, for buying Russian oil. So that is one of the big drivers. But I would say another one that's overlooked, and this is where, again, the Africa relationship becomes important, is also gold. Russia
Hmm.
has been building up its gold reserves for many years now, but that
Right.
accelerated in 2021, just before the start of the war in Ukraine. And in fact, there's a kind of correlation, some people believe, between the Wagner Group's very accelerated operations, very aggressive operations in places like Central African Republic, Sudan, Mali, where there's big gold reserves, um, sort of a kind of drive to kind of capture that territory, so that Russian gold extraction companies could come in the nick of time, basically, and insulate Russia from the blowback, financial blowback of the war.
It's interesting. So let's see. We got one question in the question and answer block I didn't address. There was a couple others that I answered kind of on my own just quickly, and I apologize to the audience members for maybe having been a little bit too quick on that one. But we're going to circle back a little bit to this idea of perceptions of national security, and we talked a little bit about the information space and how that has affected kind of perceptions. And you meant, the discussion kind of centered on identity groups in some way, but you did mention the generational aspect of this too. And the question from this audience member actually had to kind of touches on that. It says, to what extent, if any, is there research or analysis on members of the millennial, Gen X, and younger generations being able to better discern and process information via the internet as opposed to older generations concerning national political discourse?
Mhm.
Boomers, being basically watching TV. I had this conversation with our coordinator before. I'm a boomer technically. I don't watch any TV, hardly any. So besides golf and football, but so I get my news off much more like a Gen Xer or a millennial or a Gen Z on the internet. Are they better? Do we have analysis that says they understand the world and how it works better than the boomers do?
Well,
And I don't
better.
want to, I'm not pejorative. I'm a boomer. Most of my friends are boomers, as it turns out. So I'm not being pejorative here, but there is obviously a generational difference.
Absolutely, there's a definite difference. We don't have the data yet, and we didn't ask specifically, you know, what is the quality of information that you're getting, or like what is, it's kind of hard to test that
Right, for
in
sure.
a kind of even a focus group or survey environment. But we did ask questions about where do you get your information about world affairs.
Oh, interesting.
And of course, there was a huge gap,
Right.
just certainly off the charts. Number one, you know, Twitter, TikTok. TikTok actually was number one for
Yeah.
most of the youth group, which I thought was interesting because I never touch it. Um,
Yeah. I don't either. But Gen Z is all over it. That's just what they do, right?
Absolutely. Well, look, I mean, it's not just, videos. It's got a search function. It's got a lot of information there. And it's rapid fire, right? And it's
Yeah.
quick hits, quick little bites. And people are a little bit less text-based now. Twitter, of course, is a bit broken, or X, we should say.
Yeah.
I should stop saying Twitter. That makes me old. Um,
I
you
don't know, it
know,
makes you less crazy in my book, but whatever.
Facebook is for grandma nowadays, right?
Yeah.
So, right, it's
But
actually
even TikTok is moving to Facebook, right? Because Reels is a thing for boomers. I mean, I know
that's
boomers are
right.
watching Reels now, and that's the
Absolutely. But in
I,
terms of where people are getting their information, young people are getting their information from TikTok, right? Number one. Number two is X. Number three might be Threads. That was kind of in there, but Instagram, of course. So, and certainly what we saw when we were just sort of looking across the entire demographic,
mhm.
um, some TV watching, but it was actually surprising. At all different ages, it seemed like social media was the primary source for uptake of news. Now, it was notable that there was a kind of an embrace of, I would say, can't call it fake news, but strange news, like Epoch Times,
Hmm.
these types of sites that are very disconnected from sort of fact-based information. I think that actually was very prevalent in the 40, 50 above.
Hmm.
Certainly saw a number of different responses from people who were in their 40s and 50s,
Hmm.
saying that they were getting their information from those types of sources. So,
Interesting.
uh, yeah, I mean, there's maybe a little bit more vulnerability on some level for the older generation in terms of their kind of inflexibility around like where they get their news from.
Yeah, interesting. There's a new book out about the mental health crisis in the millennium, not the millennial, the Gen Z generation, because they grew up with a, a 6-inch screen in their face and lived the world of social media, and has created this anxious generation that was overprotected physically, as I think the thesis is, overprotected physically and underprotected virtually, and have created that. So while they may have a little more sophistication in the virtual space, I'm not sure their grasp on reality is any better. Or if they are, they're not dealing with it particularly well, because there is, in fact, a mental health crisis in that generation that extends quite wide, and certainly in American society. Different topic for a different day. All right, I'm going to give you a couple minutes to wrap up. We have no more questions up from our audience to move the conversation along. I am tired, as I'm sure you are. This has been a really good conversation. I've enjoyed it, actually, very much. I always do when you and I converse. Any kind of final thoughts on where you're headed? What's going on? I know you've got a book coming out. Did you want to talk about that? What's going on?
Oh yeah, the Forever book. Yes, that is coming out sometime this fall.
Yeah, what did you call it? The Forever book? Is that what
It is called the Forever book. It's the Forever project. Putin's sledgehammer. How the Wagner Group and how Russia fell into mercenary chaos. Hopefully coming to a bookstore near you in the fall, and it's really a story kind of Yevgeny Prigozhin, but also a lot of the things that we just talked about, trying to contextualize how how it is that Russia became so dependent on sort of pay-to-play warriors in this 21st century modern world. And it is a complicated story, not an easy one to tell.
That's evolving, right? Still, which is
It's
harder to
evolving.
write it down, right?
Yes, absolutely. It's been definitely a challenge to hit that moving target.
So just on that note, I was thinking, as you're talking about the Wagner Group and the transition to this less kind of proxy relationship with it. You teach a course in the MA on proxy warfare. Does that course have to change now with this conversation? Do we change one of the lessons, at least on Wagner, and see how the evolution of proxy war can kind of move? And do we see something like that changing in this case of Iran, as well as Hamas creates more problems in those relationships?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think we, come this fall, after we get kind of over the hurdle of the book writing, it'll be time to kind of take a deeper look at that particular case. I mean, I think it's just one of the most interesting exemplars of what happens when a country has a desire to be an empire, but doesn't have the diplomatic clout to do it yet, and doesn't have the manpower to do it, and doesn't have the money, and internally lacks the kind of political cohesiveness to bring that off, right?
Sure.
Empires are always kind of born of ambitions and shortages of resources in some ways, right? And they tend to overextend themselves.
Right.
In
Right.
Russia's case, this is really a story of an empire that overextended itself, rebuilt itself, and then overextended itself again. And I think that in itself has a lot of lessons for the cost of proxy warfare that need revisiting for sure.
Interesting. Really good stuff. Outstanding. Well, without any objections from our audience, I think I'll call it an evening. Candace, fantastic discussion. Great work. You're doing incredible work with your projects at New America as part of the Future Security Initiative. We are looking forward to the new course of the fall, and your continued participation in the MA. We're certainly grateful to have you.
Thank you.
Great time. We'll do it again, maybe next year after the book's out.
Sounds good.
All right. Thank you so much, everybody, and have a nice evening. And we'll see you hopefully in the fall on our events when we start up again. Thank you.
Thanks.